let me go ahead and get into the word this morning. We are now in John chapter 2. And I'm going to read quite a bit of verses, so just bear with me. But I need you to get the whole context of the story that we're about to discuss for our remaining time together. Starting in verse 1. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. And Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and so they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He didn't realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. How many of you all know that there are people in your life that don't know where the change in your life comes from, but you get the opportunity to tell them it's from Jesus? I could preach a whole other message about that, but I'll save your time today. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink, but you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So, Father, may we leave here today believing in your Son, Jesus, because of the miracles that he's done in our lives and in this room. It's in his name that we pray all of these things. And everybody said, amen. Why don't you, on your way to your seat, turn to some neighbors and give them a high five, a handshake, or a hug. Several years ago, my wife Chelsea and I, this is before we had kids, long before we had kids, we were blessed with an opportunity to take a trip to the Pacific side, the west coast side of Mexico. We were given a timeshare, and so it made our flights and our stay much cheaper. But while we were gifted this timeshare, we had the opportunity to explore some different options for a vacation destination. And we chose the west coast of Mexico for some pretty obvious reasons, mainly because of the marketing. Now, how many know these resorts, they got some pretty cool marketing tactics. But this one in particular caught our eye because of all of the promises they make to you about how the tranquil Pacific, almost said specific, waters are nice and calm. How the sun glistens on your skin, how there's the refreshing coolness of delicious and delightful non-alcoholic refreshers. And if that's not enough, what they promise you is that when you arrive on site and you get to your guest suite, that you'll experience the serenity of their amenities within just a footstep or two of where you are being located while you are staying there for the week. And then, and this is the kicker for Chelsea and I, you'll feel at peace. Come on, somebody, how many of y'all want to go on vacation? You want to feel at peace? And so we wanted to feel at peace. That was the promise that was made to us. And so Chelsea and I, we were sold. We packed up our bags. We paid as little money as we had to get on that flight. And we hopped 2 6-hour flights to the west coast of Mexico. And when we arrived, let me tell you that the marketing was exactly true to life for the most part. We got on site and the waters were tranquil. The sun did glisten on our skin. We felt at peace, and there was the serenity of amenities within a footstep of us. But when we got in our guest suite, everything was fine until we looked at the large glass sliding door, and we cracked it open to the sound of beep, 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 construction noises. Men yelling expletives in Spanish. Don't ask me how I knew that. There were buildings being constructed. There was concrete being poured. There was trucks that were loud. And all of a sudden, we realized that the guest suite that we were staying at was still under construction. When we get to John chapter 2, because we've just transitioned out of John chapter 1, what we need to understand is that Jesus' full identity as God is still under construction. John has already made his case, John the Apostle who wrote this book, he's already made his case that Jesus is God. And so for the next 12 chapters of his narrative, he takes his time teaching you and I, reinforcing this idea that Jesus is truly God. But he is building his argument, if you will. He is building Jesus' character. Jesus' character is still in process. Jesus is God, but for you and I as the reader, he is building his case chapter by chapter, verse by verse, section by section, so that you and I can see the fullness of Jesus throughout the storyline of Jesus' earthly ministry. At the end of chapter 1, Jesus now has 6 out of 12 of his disciples recruited. He has invited them to join him and follow him as he is traveling throughout the regions on his itinerant missionary journey, if you will. Now, Jesus, at the end of chapter 1, he meets a particular one of those 6 disciples by the name of Nathanael, who we so endearingly nicknamed Nate, because I'm a little biased. Now, Nate, he was a little bit of the oddball of the disciples that Jesus recruited, and Jesus had to promise Nate some things. Now, here's why I mentioned this before I mention it, because what Jesus promises Nate at the end of chapter 1 hinges into the story of chapter 2. You see, Nate didn't understand this idea of Jesus as God yet. He really didn't understand Jesus as the Messiah because Jesus was from the small town of Nazareth. Now, to prove that Jesus was who he says he was, he says, Nate, I saw you sitting under the fig tree. Only God could have seen Nate sitting under the fig tree because nobody else knew about Nate's private spot under the fig tree as he meditated on the Word of God. And so Nate believes in him, but after Nate exclaims to Jesus that he believes in him, Jesus promises them this: Nate, you believed in me because I saw you under the fig tree. But if you'll follow me, far greater things will you see. And it's with this ending that we enter into John chapter 2, where of all of the places that Jesus could choose to go, he decided to go to a wedding. Now, here's what you got to understand. These 6 out of 12 disciples, they were anxiously awaiting the moment, having followed Jesus and understood his messiahship, if you will. They were anxiously awaiting the moment when Jesus would reveal his full strategy to them. They were anxiously awaiting the moment, now that they had been recruited by Jesus, now that they were actively following Jesus, that Jesus was going to tell them the strategy for how he was going to take back the Jewish nation under his leadership, that he was going to rally the troops for battle against the Jewish oppressors, which at this time were the Romans, how Jesus was going to renew within the Jewish people this deep longing and desire and love for the covenant that God had established with them way back when, that Jesus was going to secure the Jewish borders of this time period to establish the eternal dynasty that the prophets had foretold of long ago. The disciples were following Jesus because he was the Messiah, but they were waiting on these things. They expected these things. And so when they followed Jesus, and Jesus' first order of business is to go to a wedding, they'd be a little bit confused. And if I were Jesus, or if I were the disciples rather, I would have been a little bit confused too. If I were one of Jesus' disciples, I'd be telling Jesus, who is the Messiah, Jesus, ain't nobody got time for a wedding. You're on a strict timeline to kick the Romans out of our nation and establish this eternal dynasty. Jesus, not only do you not have time for this, but let me go ahead and create an executive team to help you make decisions, to keep you on track, to keep you focused so that you don't get sidetracked with little things like this unimportant little wedding. Jesus, why don't you take the invite, get a gift from Amazon, and ship it to them in the mail and say thank you and go on your way? But you know what? Jesus doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. Why would Jesus, all of the things he could do after recruiting 6 out of 12 of his disciples, choose to go to a wedding? I mean, if I were in Jesus' shoes, I would have tried to impress them right from the get-go if I wanted to keep them along the journey with me. And yet the reality is for you and I, the truth that we can take from this immediately when Jesus' decision is to go to this wedding is this: it's that God will go where he's invited. God will go where he's invited. You want to know what the order of importance is for the God of the universe? Matter of fact, King David asked this question in Psalms 8, chapter 8, verse 4, when he said this, "What are mere mortals that you should think of them? Human beings that you should care for them." And a lot of us, the reality of our lives is we're processing a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. We're asking the very same questions. God, how is it that you, being of great grandeur and great mightiness, how is it that you care for me? How is it that you know the numbers on my head? How is it that you know the amount of sparrows that are running around, flying around here on earth? How is it that you know to feed me when I am hungry and give me water when I am thirsty? How is it that you know my innermost thoughts and my desires? And how is it then that knowing those things, you even care for me? But the God of the universe, in his order of business, the most important thing to our God is that he will go where he is invited. The reality for you and I today is that God, if it is important to us, it is important to him. However, you and I, we tend to view the ordinary as too ordinary to invite God into it. How many of you all would be willing to admit that you feel like your problems oftentimes are too small and God is way too big and too distant for you to invite a big God into your small little world? Lest we forget that the same God who parted the Red Sea also filtered water for the Israelites at Marah in the wilderness. Lest we forget that the same God who burned down or sent down fire from heaven to burn up an altar also spoke to Elijah in a still small voice. Lest we forget that the same God whose spirit hovered upon the 120 at the upper room on the day of Pentecost is the same God who filled this little widow's jar of oil as she was starving. Lest we forget that the same God who in all power wiped out enemy armies was also the same God who rode in on a donkey into the city of Jerusalem before he would go to the cross of Calvary and die for the sins of humanity. The same big God who did all of those grand things, the same big God who is full of victory and power and might, he is omniscient and he is all-powerful, is the same God who wants to be in the details of your life if you will invite him there. He just wants your invitation. And if you will invite him not just into the grandeur of your life, but also into the ordinary of your life, he will add extra to your ordinary and far greater things will you see. And so he is going to a wedding. At the invitation, he drags his curious disciples along to this wedding at Cana, only to get there and to discover that something was horribly wrong. We find out in the text of John chapter 2 that Jesus' mother Mary is present along with the first 6 of his disciples. It's likely that given Cana is not too far from the town of Nazareth where Jesus grew up, that Jesus actually knew the bride and groom personally. And because he knew the bride and groom personally, because they were not from prominence, if you will, it's likely, according to many Bible scholars, that the bride and groom were financially strained. Now, it was the responsibility of the bride and groom at the Jewish wedding to accommodate all of the guests that were there. And to accommodate this many people for this prolonged period of time would have been a financial strain as it was. But let me just lay out for you the scene. Because Jewish weddings are an incredibly big deal in this cultural time period. Matter of fact, they are such a big deal that they actually started years before the context of what's happening right here in this moment. And I actually put it on the screen for you so that you can see what's happening. The first thing that happens in the wedding process for a Jew, if you will, is something called the betrothal. You'll recall that later on in Luke chapter 2, one of the gospel accounts that's writing about the life and ministry of Jesus, it says something about Mary, Jesus' mom, and Joseph, Jesus' dad. They were betrothed to be married. That means they were technically married by a legally binding contract. In the betrothal part of the process, the groom would actually bring a document to the bride's house, to the bride's father, and he would give the bride's father a bride price for the bride. If the bride's family agreed to the bride price, they would sign on the dotted line, and there was a legally binding contract for the two of them. Now, here's the caveat to all of this. Even though on paper they were married, they did not live together, and they stayed pure until after the celebration, which is at the end of the process. After the betrothal period came the waiting period. So The binding contract would be signed on the dotted line. The groom would go back and return home, and he would build an addition onto his family's house for his bride. We don't know how long, it's an undetermined length of time that it would take the groom to build this addition on the house for his new family to begin to form. We just know it was an extended length of time. You recall that there were oftentimes he spoke in parables about this waiting period, and he's actually talking about this cultural phenomenon where the groom and the bride would actually have to wait for an undetermined amount of time, and she didn't know when the groom was coming back for her. She just knew that when the moment was right, she needed to be ready. Oftentimes, Jesus is talking about that in the relationship between himself and the church, that we as the bride of Christ do not know the time that Jesus is going to come back. We just know he's going to come back, and we need to be ready. There's the betrothal. There's the wait. At the end of the wait, the father of the groom, he would have to approve the addition on his house. So he would approve the addition on the groom's house so that the groom and the bride could live in. And at this point, the transition goes from the wait to the processional. At the processional, the groom would happily and joyfully go back to the bride's house to pick up his bride. And at this moment, there was a processional of dancing and joy and even the lighting of lamps as they followed the bride and groom back to the groom's house for the celebration. And this is the scene of John chapter 2, the celebration. Listen to this, a 7-day period of feasting and dancing and music and even the drinking of wine. For John chapter 2 to say that they ran out of wine, to you and I, we look at that and we're like, that ain't a big deal. I mean, quite frankly, like, if I were the planner of a wedding that was 7 days long, I probably would have run out of wine on day one because I am not a planner. They are having to plan for an undetermined amount of guests who they have the responsibility of accommodating for that 7-day period while those guests are there. And so for them to run out of wine, to you and I as Western readers look at that and we're like, this is not a big deal, but it was an incredibly big deal to the bride and groom, and it was an incredibly big deal to Mary. The reality is that sometimes what we consider small things to us are often big things to other people. How many of y'all know that you've been through some things in your life that if you were to tell somebody else, you sound stupid because they look small, but to you, it's really a big deal. It was a big ordeal in your life. And so this is the kind of situation the bride and groom are in. It's kind of like when your phone doesn't charge and in the morning you don't hear your alarm go off and you're late for work. It's kind of like the moment when it's like negative 30 degrees outside in the winter like it was this past year, and your car doesn't start in the morning when you need to go to work. It's kind of like when your kids don't eat breakfast in the morning and you're already running late to your destination, and so you get in the car and you get on the road, and then your kids start crying because they're helplessly hungry, and you have to stop at McDonald's, and it just takes 10 minutes outside of your way to get to the destination that you're already late to. It's kind of like when your finances, you're scraping the last $15 in your checking account, and all you have in your freezer is a couple of Dino Nuggets left, and in the back of your pantry is a can of beans from 2015. This is the moment for the bride and groom. Sometimes it's not a matter of things that are small. Sometimes it's just a matter of feeling small. And when you feel small, everything else around you ends up becoming a big deal. And you feel like your world is spiraling out of control. For the bride and groom, this was an incredibly important scenario. For the bride and groom, this was actually kind of a desperate moment for them. To run out of wine at a wedding celebration in a Jewish culture was a big problem that had actually lasting repercussions. First of all, it meant that they had not planned the proper amount of wine to accommodate the guests for those 7 days. Second of all, it spoke to the fact that they were likely in a financial strain already to be able to accommodate those guests. And third of all, to not have any wine at a Jewish celebration was a social disgrace. For that couple to run out of wine was for that couple to have a tainted reputation for the rest of their life. This was a mistake that should the guests who were out there laughing and drinking and feasting and having a good time, this was a moment that should the guests find out that there was no more wine, it would have followed the bride and groom for the rest of their lives. And we live in a small area, in a small town. How many of you know people talk? There's so-and-so at the Lowe's. They're trying to get some wood for whatever. Man, did you hear about their wedding? How things just went totally haywire for them? How they ran out of wine? Man, did you hear that their budget was like negative $10 by the time they got to the end of their wedding? Man, did you hear they couldn't even afford to pay for a couple of more grapes to put in the grape stomper so that they could ferment the grape juice to get some more wine? This was what was following the bride and groom around. Had it not been for one important detail, they invited Jesus to their wedding. You can pick up on the desperation of this moment, not because the bride and groom came to Jesus, but because Mary, Jesus' mom, did. And she's like, oh my gosh, Jesus, there is no way for us to be able to provide this wine to the guests. And if we don't provide the wine to this guest, then I don't really know what we're going to do. Have you ever been in a situation where it felt like there was no way out? This is the situation. Big or small, they were in a moment where it felt like there was no way out for them except for the one detail that mattered the most, and that's that they invited Jesus to the party. And I wonder if there's anybody in the room, and I wonder if there's anybody watching online who you would be willing to admit that you're in a situation right now where it feels like there is no way out. There's turmoil in your relationships, your marriage is on the rocks, your friendships have been separated, your kids are treating you with contempt. I don't know the situation in your life. Maybe, just maybe, you're numbing the pain of your life with suppressants, or you're trying to drown out your thoughts with alcohol, and you feel like there is no way for you to get out of the pit that you have found yourself in. But maybe, just maybe, if you invited Jesus to the party, it would change some things about your life. And I promise you that when you invite Jesus, Jesus changes everything. Mary, in verse 4, desperately goes to Jesus because she knows that the bride and the groom are in a no way out kind of situation. But Jesus is the only one who can make a way where there is no way. And when she comes to Jesus, she's not appealing to Jesus as her son. She's appealing to Jesus' identity as God in this moment. The reason that Jesus responds to her in verse 4 the way he responds to her is because Jesus knows that when he performs a miracle like this, in certain ways, when he puts his power on display, people are going to know about it. Jesus is not hasty in his decision making when it comes to even the smallest need, because even the smallest need matters to the bigger picture. And I need you to catch this for your life too, because there are a lot of times we're bringing our problems to God. We're in a no way out kind of situation. We're in a desperate need where we need God to move on our behalf, even in the smallest details of our lives. But you need to be reminded that just because you need it when you think you need it doesn't mean God thinks you need it right when you think you need it. God is not as hasty as you and I are in our decision making. And God knows that there are some things in our lives that we are not yet equipped to be able to handle because we don't have the character developed just yet. Maybe, just maybe, you're waiting for something in the room this morning to happen, and God hasn't given it to you. It's not a no, it's just a not yet. And when you get it, you'll be all the more thankful you had it at the time that you got it and not before you thought you needed it. There is no possible solution to the problem that the bride and groom found themselves in. Mary didn't know how they were going to make it. There was no way for her to execute on this in an efficient manner, to gather some people to purchase enough wine to make a difference now that the wine had run out. There was no way that they could have multiplied the wine at this very moment, considering the process to make wine lasts weeks. There was no way, except for the God of the universe had been invited to the wedding party. and he was willing to do what they asked. And when you invite Jesus into your ordinary, he tends to make it extraordinary. When you invite Jesus into the natural moments of your life, he makes it supernatural. When you invite Jesus into the mundane moments of your life, only something miraculous can take place, but you have to trust him with it. And Jesus' disciples may have not known why he'd choose to go to a wedding. That's crazy. He is on a 3.5-year journey leading to the cross of Calvary. They didn't know that yet. They just knew that Jesus was the Messiah and he was on mission from heaven. But to think that he would stop and go to a wedding was something brand new for them, and they didn't know what to do about it, all with the exception that in this moment, Jesus is teaching his disciples, and he's teaching something you and I about the character of our God, and it's that oftentimes the greatest miracles God performs are in the most mundane, ordinary places of your life and mine. Sometimes the prayers that we need to be praying are not these broad, grand prayers about what God can do. Sometimes the greatest moments in our lives are when we start getting incredibly specific in detail about the things that we need, and we are asking God persistently to show up. And when he does, those are the moments that you can be most grateful because you can check him off as he does it. The disciples needed to know that God is big, but he's not afraid of the small either. And it's not the devil in the details. It's God. Mary recognizes the solution is impossible, but Jesus majors in impossibilities. And so she appeals to her son's identity as God and tells his servants, do whatever he says. And this is an important detail for you and I consider as we ask God to intervene on our behalf, as we ask God for miracles in the details of our lives. But this is the part that as I was reading the text this week that jumped out to me. It's that Jesus, out of all of the ways he could have chosen to do this miracle. I mean, later on we read about Jesus performing the miracle of the 5,000 where he's feeding 5,000 plus individuals. Later on, we hear of all of these grand miracles that Jesus is performing, and yet in this moment, the way that Jesus chooses to perform this first miracle should mean something about the method that he chooses to do miracles in through our lives. Jesus could have chosen any other method except he chose the 6 stone water jars. These water jars were somehow used for ceremonial washing. Whether it was for after somebody in the Jewish community was unclean and they had to go for washing after they met with the priest to become clean, these jars were somehow used in the process. But here's what I love about what the Bible describes about these jars. This is why I believe Jesus chose to use these jars. First of all, and you can catch this in verse 6, it says that they were nearby. The jars were available to be used. The second detail about these jars, it says the jars were empty, which means that the jars were ready to be filled. I'm watching this play out like a movie. All of these characters who are concurrently operating in this exact circumstance. Mary out of desperation, the bride and groom crying because they don't know what they do. Jesus like, whoa, hold up, I got this covered. Just wait until the miracle takes place. Jesus' disciples, arms crossed in the background because they're waiting on some kind of grand moment from Jesus, their new Messiah. And all I can think about in John chapter 2 in this moment is the 6 stone jars. Because in a good movie, you find yourself with the character in the story. And I don't find myself with Mary. I don't find myself with Jesus. I don't find myself as one of the disciples. I don't even find myself as one of the servants that fills up the water jar. You know what I find myself with in the story? The jar. Because I found out that there's so many times in my life that I was near to Jesus and that I was empty. And if I'm near and I'm empty, he's willing to do the impossible in my life. You got to get this for your life. that if you are willing to identify with the 6 stone water jars, Jesus can change your eternal destination. He can change you from the inside out, and that is exactly what he did. These 6 water jars were beautiful on the outside. They were made out of stone, which meant that that bacteria could not connect to the material that these jars were made out of. They were perfect in every way on the outside, but in the inside, they were left empty. And I wonder if there's anybody in the room, for so long you felt like a jar. You've been practicing dead religion. You've been trying to get better on the outside. You've been trying to climb out of the hole and the messes that you found yourself in. You've been trying to fulfill on the inside what can only be fulfilled by meeting spiritual needs. And Jesus, that is the God of the universe, is the only one who can meet the spiritual need, who can fill you up when you are feeling empty, if you're willing to be nearby. Only God can change a heart of stone. Only God can fill an empty spiritual vessel. Only God, listen, can turn water into wine. Would you stand to your feet with me? Water into wine. This is deeper than you think. That God would take a natural moment and do something supernatural in it. That God would take an ordinary moment and do something extraordinary. That God would take an ordinary place, and this would be the place that he first chooses to do something incredible in. And I wonder if there's anybody in the room this morning that feels a lot like this stone pot. The wine from water is representative of a couple of things throughout the scriptures. Without weirding you out, I'm just going to tell you the honest truth. Wine is representative, in this case, with Jesus' blood. The wine in this moment was a foreshadowing of 3.5 years later when Jesus would go to the cross of Calvary and die for the sins of humanity. Because the blood of Jesus Christ doesn't change you on the outside at first. It does change you on the inside. And what is inside gets on the outside when Jesus is in it, but it starts in here. And a lot of you in the room this morning, what you are looking for is because you are trying to find what cannot change you on the inside. Only Jesus can do that. It's not only representative of the blood of Jesus Christ, it's also representative of a new covenant. Because the Israelite people, they were still operating by dead religion. They were still operating by, if I do all of these things, then I can get access to God, then I can get to heaven. And what Jesus is saying here, with 6 stone water pots that were nearby, that were empty, and that were ready to be filled, is that it's not about good works. It's about what I've done, because I'm God. And that's what John the Apostle is trying to teach us through John chapter 2, the wedding at Cana. You and I, we need God to change us from the inside out. We need God to fulfill us from the inside out. And that's the story of the cross of Calvary. That is the gospel according to Jesus Christ. That you were dead and gone in your sin. That you were a water pot trying to get clean on the outside. Not realizing that it takes an outside source to fill you up on the inside.